A young man wakes up in the middle of the night. His bedside clock blinks 1 a.m. His dorm room is quiet, yet his mind is swimming. In the dream he'd just awoken from, he'd seen a potential answer to a question that had been bouncing around in his head over the last month. The question was, why doesn't the zero-point energy of a vacuum create a large cosmological constant? It's not a question most people would think about, but in the world of physics it was significant, and the answer he'd seen in his dream might solve it. The answer was both elegant and surprisingly simple, a different, possibly novel way of looking at Einstein's relativity. Now at the moment, society does not consider this young man a genius. His parents and friends never viewed him as an especially talented kid, and if we total all the facts of the story up to this point, we, the viewers, can't determine whether he's a genius either. Really, all this young man has done is attempted to answer a question. He doesn't even know if his answer is correct. He just thinks it might be correct and wants to explore this new possibility. The answer could very well be a dud, a line of exploration that leads nowhere. But what if the answer is right? Well, in that case, society might indeed end up terming this young man a genius, an innovator who paved the way for a new field of scientific inquiry. Or maybe it will be that this answer was a single instance of genius in an otherwise uneventful career in one man's life. In any case, the term genius seems very dependent on one thing, whether his answer is correct. If it's not correct, well, the label of genius probably isn't appropriate. But he could still have genius. Maybe this answer is wrong, but the questions it leads to reveals a correct answer. Or maybe this young man leaves science altogether and goes on to become an extremely famous musician. Surely there would be some who consider him genius then. This leaves us with a few perplexing questions about genius. What is genius exactly? What differentiates genius from simple intelligence? Is genius a trait? Can a single thought be genius? If so, what kinds of thoughts would fall under that category? Can a person be a genius, or is it their creations which are actually genius? Are there different types of genius? Could someone like Michael Jordan be considered a genius because he was uniquely skilled at something? Do your ideas need to be right to be genius? Or is genius more like the process of having a good idea? Does something need broad appeal or broad recognition to be genius? Does genius even exist? These might seem to be questions with extremely open-ended and subjective answers, and yet, genius is a term people continue to use to this day. So what is it? In this episode of The List, we're going to be grappling with these questions. If you want to know what this podcast is about, I explain the whole thing in episode 0. Also, as I mention every episode, I have a book out called Value Assignment: The Primary Function of the Brain, which is available for free in both text and audio form. It was my life's work prior to this podcast, and I appreciate when anyone new reads it. Links are in the description. Lastly, if you enjoy this episode, feel free to like and subscribe and all that. Now let's get on with the episode. Genius is a topic most people don't seem to think about much. It's one of those terms that many people throw around without much consideration of what it is. And when you look at the way the term genius has commonly been used, there are some pretty strong discrepancies. Going back over the last several hundred years, it seems the term genius has most commonly been used to describe people. Many physicists agree that Isaac Newton was an early historical example of a genius. Before Newton, you had people like Galileo and Da Vinci, who many consider to be examples of geniuses within their time period. In more modern times, you also have the likes of Einstein and Tesla, who most would agree were both preeminent geniuses who had an outsized impact on modern science. In these cases, the term genius describes the person. This usage also suggests that genius has something to do with intellect. If you look at each of the people I just named, all of them performed intellectual feats and had ideas nobody had ever seen before. Their ideas also went on to influence later scientific and technological developments, some of which we still use today. At the same time, it's also very common for people to use the term genius when talking about things people have invented or done. For example, instead of calling H.P. Lovecraft himself a genius, some people might say that certain parts of his books were genius. This creates a bit of an interesting contradiction. If genius is supposed to be a term describing people, how can it also be a term to describe things and ideas? Can an inanimate object or an abstract idea with no will of its own really be all that genius? The idea didn't do anything. The idea was simply floating around in the ether until someone thought of it and used it. A human had to have the wits and creativity to employ the idea. This leads us to the first important question about genius. Is genius a part of your personality, sort of like a dynamic character trait that some people have? Or is genius more like an immobile quality which certain things in the universe possess? Well, if we take the way the term genius is commonly used, it seems that genius is in fact both. The term genius is commonly used to describe both people and things. So that's it. Episode over, right? People use genius in contradictory ways. It has no consistent definition, so therefore genius must be impossible to determine. Well, I wouldn't be so sure. While the public might use the term genius in contradictory manners, it doesn't necessarily mean that genius can't be determined or defined. Maybe there is a way to understand genius if we just look at it from a different perspective. Okay then, assuming genius can be understood, how would we go about determining what it is? We could look at the dictionary definitions of genius, but unfortunately there are many definitions that dictionaries will give. For example, Merriam-Webster has 10 definitions of genius, and some of them have nothing to do with what you think. The first definition is an attendant spirit of a person or place. You really have to get down to the bottom before they start talking about genius as a mental thing. The last three are the definitions we're concerned with. One is extraordinary intellectual power, especially as manifested in creative activity. Another definition is a person empowered with extraordinary mental superiority. Genius is also defined as showing or suggesting great cleverness, skill, or originality. If you notice, all three of these definitions are extremely broad. What exactly is mental superiority? What is intellectual power? These things aren't really made clear. And while these definitions might sound vaguely reasonable, they don't answer any of the questions I posed before. When it comes to complex subjects, dictionaries are usually only there to give you a brief overview of something. They aren't usually sufficient to explain the mechanical interworkings of a complex topic. And furthermore, if you know about me and my work, you know when it comes to subjects like this, I'm not going to rely on a dictionary to do my thinking for me. So if we're going to figure out how genius works, we're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way. Now, we've already considered the possibility that genius is either a personality trait or a quality that some items in the universe possess. But let's presume that neither of those things is completely true. What else could genius be? Well, it's possible that genius is neither a person nor a thing, but is actually a special kind of process. It is true that genius inventions only happen after a person goes through some kind of process of creation. But the first problem is, if genius is a process, that would contradict the way people normally use the term. When people say that Tesla or his ideas were genius, they're not usually talking about the process Tesla used to get those ideas. But let's say for a second that genius is a process. What kinds of processes could be considered genius? Is it the process of having an original or creative idea? When you first have an idea, how do you actually know if your idea is original or even creative? Really, the only way to know is by testing and or comparing your idea against other people's ideas. Which means genius could really just be the process of trial and error. First you come up with an idea, and if it turns out to be wrong, you just come up with another. And you keep doing this until you get something right. Eventually, when you do get it correct, that could be what genius is. If you recall the young man at the beginning of the episode, we know that what he's doing is attempting to solve a problem. Basically, he's performing trial and error. The idea he thought of in his dream is a trial, but if he finds out later that his idea has already been invalidated by another physicist, that would be considered error. Furthermore, we know that most people, even people considered geniuses, do not automatically get everything right on the first try. Maybe you aren't aware, but the famous physicist Isaac Newton had a private obsession with alchemy, the notion that one can transform lead into gold and purify substances with the right chemical process. And unfortunately, alchemy is a practice that's been all but debunked at this point in history. This tells us that even people like Isaac Newton went through some kind of process of trial and error, even if some of the errors were not realized until after his death. At the very least, we know that genius probably involves trial and error. But is genius just trial and error? Well, actually, no, it's not. The reason is simple. Because not all trial and error processes or creative processes result in genius inventions. There are many scientists who've used trial and error in their work and who made important contributions to science, but were never considered geniuses, such as Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin by accident. Also, if genius was just the process of having a creative idea, then every person with an unusual or out-of-the-box idea could be considered genius. This includes flat earthers, this includes paranoid schizophrenics, pretty much anyone with a creative or original idea. And we know that's not how it works. Just because you've gone through some creative exercise does not make your ideas good. And even when your ideas are good, it does not automatically make you a genius. A 5-year-old is not necessarily a genius for figuring out that you can stack things on top of one another to reach the cookie jar, especially when many other 5-year-olds have figured out the same thing. This suggests that whatever genius is, it has something to do with originality and intention, as well as the greater valuability of your ideas. Now, it's possible that genius requires trial and error. If every genius we know has used trial and error in their work in some way, then we can probably conclude that trial and error is a necessary part of it. But trial and error by itself does not make genius. There are many people in the world who have creative ideas, but only a few are considered geniuses. Another thing we haven't really explored yet is the topic of musical genius. For the most part, the term genius is traditionally associated with intellectual pursuits and the people who are good at them. However, the term has also been used in regards to creative fields as well, particularly music. Mozart was an early example of someone who was widely considered a musical genius, because he was so creative, talented, skilled, and influential that he single-handedly shaped the musical trends of the time. And he did all this in an era where not many people made music. In more modern times, there are many artists who are commonly placed in the musical genius category, such as Michael Jackson, the Beatles, and Elvis Presley. Like Mozart, these artists had an outsized influence on the musical trends of the time. Now here's the first issue we run into. Unlike intellectual pursuits and scientific discoveries, the enjoyability and influence of music is much harder to quantify. When a physicist creates a new theory of gravity, that theory can be directly compared against current physics. We can test whether that theory is right or wrong, or whether it gives a better explanation for something scientists are observing. Musical genius is not like this. Apart from one's vocal or instrumental skills, or their understanding of music theory, musical genius can't actually be tested in a systematic manner. Mostly it seems to boil down to how much others like your music. And of course, musical tastes are incredibly subjective. Not all people like the same music. Even the greatest artists have haters. In fact, some people don't even like music at all, which to me is unimaginable, but it still happens. It's commonly understood that a song one person finds moving, another may find intolerably boring. What one hears as rich and complex, another might hear as awkward and off-putting. Most of these differences are due to listener bias. But since musical genius can't really be measured or tested against anything, the only thing you have to go on is listener bias. There is something important to mention though. In the past, the label of musical genius was given away very rarely, almost as rarely as the label of intellectual genius. In the past, to be considered a musical genius, it wasn't enough for people to like your music. There had to be something about your music which was a mix of unique, influential, and requiring extreme skill. However, it seems that today, the bar for musical genius has lowered quite a bit. Today, people will call any musician who's popular a genius, almost as if popularity equals genius. Now, on one hand, I do think popularity can be a byproduct of genius. It's certainly true that genius individuals often become popular for their work. But is popularity the same thing as genius? Well, let's think about it. There are many musicians who made a single famous song or who had a short stint of popularity. If popularity equals genius, then that would mean every single one of these people are, in fact, geniuses. Even novelty songs and one-off hits like the Happy Birthday song would be included under that definition. If popularity equals genius, then anything popular, no matter what it is, must be genius. But this raises a question. How popular does something need to be considered genius? Would the employee handbook at Red Lobster be considered genius? Not everyone in the world knows about it, but the servers at Red Lobster all know about it. If that's not popular enough, then how popular does something need to be? Does it need to have 1 million views on YouTube? 1 billion? Does every person in the developed world have to know about something for it to be genius? When Nikola Tesla died, he was not extremely popular. So was his work not genius? Also, when we look at the reasons why things become popular, it's not always because people like those things or because they're good or creative or original. In the 1950s and 60s, there were only a select few channels you could watch on television. Because of this, the shows and programs which aired on those channels became extremely popular. Everyone knew about them because that's all you could watch. Even mediocre programs were popular because the audience was, in a sense, captive. Or how about this? Back when newspapers were more common, there were plenty of news stories that became popular simply because they were on the front page. Does that mean those news stories were genius? Or were they simply popular because they're the first thing you see when you pick up a newspaper? Even in the internet era, there are plenty of cases of things becoming popular, not because people necessarily like them or want them, but because organizations which disseminate information chose those things for you to see. Videos on YouTube have become popular in the past because YouTube programmers intentionally plastered those videos on your feed. The same is probably even true for popular musicians. We know that record labels have notoriously been very selective in terms of which musicians they promote. Maybe many of the musicians who've become popular over the years were not necessarily selected because they were the best, but were selected because the labels wanted them, for whatever miscellaneous reasons. In any case, I think equating genius with popularity oversimplifies what genius is. It also doesn't account for the reasons why things become popular. Personally, I am biased towards the older version of musical genius. In my opinion, musical genius is a term that should be given out rarely and should not just be based on popularity. I believe there are musicians who made genius music but did not end up being all that popular. I also believe there are popular musicians who are not geniuses. Of course, sometimes popularity does come with genius, but either way, I don't think popularity by itself makes something genius. There's gotta be more to it. However, since musical genius can't really be tested or measured, all I can do is give my opinion. But by far the least explored version of genius comes from the world of competition in sports. Certain people, like Michael Jordan, have such an outsized impact on the world of sports that it's possible they could be geniuses of a certain kind. Or at the very least, there might be a connection between what makes players like Jordan great and genius. Back in the day, people who knew practically nothing about basketball would show up to games just to see Jordan play. He was so good that he quite literally changed the game. Teams had to adapt their strategies to keep up with his abilities. It's possible that someone like Michael Jordan was not just talented and skilled, but had some extra capacity which enabled him to perform the way he did. As someone who spent a large part of my young life engaging in various forms of competition, I believe this may have to do with perceiving uncommon potential. Now, I don't think I was a genius of any kind, but there were a few brief moments when I was young when I was able to do things, perform feats that caught me by surprise, feats even I didn't think I was capable of. I remember these moments very vividly, and I also remember sitting down afterwards and trying to analyze what just happened. How was I able to pull these things off? What was the psychological process behind it? One particular moment happened while I was playing a first-person shooter called Halo 3. Now, maybe you don't consider video games to be an especially athletic or competitive thing, but there is a connection I'd like to make that I think is relevant. When I was in my teens, I could easily spend 10 to 12 hours a day playing Halo. One day, I was playing online, and out of the blue, I matched up with a known MLG player. For those who aren't aware, MLG was an early esports organization that regularly hosted Halo tournaments and gave out $100,000 prizes to the winners. Well, to my surprise, I was able to beat this MLG player. Now, it's possible that the player was just having a bad day or wasn't concentrated. I was also completely concentrated and playing at my peak at the time, locked in, as the Gen Zers would say. Either way, I noticed something. In the moments where I was able to best this player, my attention was focused on something specific. Many competitive activities require you to be unpredictable and to keep your opponent guessing. But how do you actually do that? Well, I think in many cases you have to intentionally look for moves that would be uncommon or unexpected in a particular situation. In other words, you must perceive uncommon potential and then commit to it while you have the brief chance to do so. If you wait too long to commit, the chance will go away, at least if you're playing a fast-paced game. And if you can't do anything unexpected or find any uncommon moves, a good opponent will be able to predict what you're going to do and will be able to dominate you. Now here's the first problem. Just because a move is uncommon or unexpected does not automatically mean that the move will be effective. Also, in order to know which moves are uncommon, you first have to know which moves are common. This is where practice comes into play. Practice essentially trains your pattern recognition, at least if you're practicing against other people. The more you train, and the more people you train against, the better you'll be at predicting opponents' moves, aka knowing what's common. But of course, practice by itself isn't enough. At high levels of competition, everyone practices like crazy. Even if you know what's common, that doesn't always cause you to win. which means you need to do something else. You need to look for what's uncommon. In other words, you or your coaches have to think of moves and strategies that are irregular or unexpected, and then you have to practice those moves and strategies to see what's actually effective. The more uncommon moves and strategies you practice, the more you'll get a sense of which moves and strategies are likely to work against your opponents in a given situation. Also, even if you can find an uncommon move that works, if you keep making that move, you'll become predictable, and your opponents, if they're good, will take advantage of that. Which means, in order to win at high levels, you have to constantly look for and find uncommon potentials that are effective. And that requires a creative talent that not many people have. No matter what sport you're looking at, the best competitors always seem to have a sense for the unlikely. This was true for Jordan, and it's also true for every other top athlete. Not only can these people see what their opponents are doing, but they can consistently navigate around their opponent's strategies by finding something unusual or unexpected and pressing on that. They also have the experience to know which uncommon moves are likely to work in a given scenario, as well as the precision to perform those moves effectively, which again comes with lots and lots of practice. Now, of course, in the case of athletics, physical ability also plays into the equation. Without the physical capacity to perform certain movements, your advantages will be limited. In many sports, you also need strong reaction times, and reaction times typically diminish with age. In some cases, simply being physically dominant is enough to make you the winner. But from what it seems, the people who are the absolute best, at least in many competitive fields, are not necessarily the tallest or fastest or strongest. The more types of competition I engage in, the more I believe that the geniuses of the competitive world are the people who are best at perceiving and executing uncommon potential. But here's what's really interesting. If we look outside the realm of competition, it seems to be the case that geniuses are people who do unique things, people who are able to seek out and capitalize on the uncommon. This is true in the world of science, it's also true in the realm of art and music. The people who are typically categorized as geniuses are people who have the creativity to see things others aren't paying attention to. When you combine that creativity with discipline and some kind of skill, maybe that's what makes a genius in any field. If this is true, then maybe a genius could be defined as a person who is especially talented at perceiving uncommon potential within some intellectual, artistic, or competitive boundary, and who has the requisite ability to realize such potential. And maybe a genius thing or idea could be defined as an invention, idea, or action which makes use of uncommon potential to successfully achieve an extremely difficult goal, create an extraordinary art piece, or accomplish some highly competitive task. If you think about it, every single person or thing which society considers genius would fit within these two definitions. Now, a critic might say,
well, these definitions are still vague. I mean, what is uncommon potential anyway? That term is not defined.
But that's the thing. You can't define uncommon potential any further, because what's uncommon changes from situation to situation. It's never something that can be easily nailed down. Trying to precisely define uncommon potential would be like trying to come up with rules for how to disobey rules. What we do know is that geniuses always make use of uncommon potential in some way within their specific area or field. And I think that tells us something about genius itself. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer had a quote, "Talent hits a target others cannot hit. Genius hits a target others cannot see." Well, maybe the reason why geniuses can do this is because of their ability to perceive uncommon potential. So that's it then. We finally have a definition of genius that might work. Now the episode's over, right? Well, actually, we're still not done yet. There's one last thing we have to discuss, and it's probably what you expected me to talk about in the beginning, which is intelligence and how that relates to genius. While it may be true that genius involves uncommon potential, it is also true that genius has always been correlated with high intellect. All the people who were considered geniuses throughout history were intelligent. This probably even includes people in the art and sports world. But is genius the same thing as high intelligence? If someone is highly intelligent, are they automatically a genius? Well, let's consider this proposition. There are, in fact, billions of people with higher than average intelligence, but higher than average is not really what we're discussing. Scoring a 105 on an IQ test doesn't make you a genius. Typically, the people who society considers genius have far above average intelligence. We're talking 3 standard deviations and up, at least in intellectual fields. There's just one problem. Not everyone with extremely high IQs actually contribute meaningfully to the arts, sciences, or competitive worlds. Take William James Sidis, for example. Born in 1898, William James Sidis had one of the highest estimated IQs in the history of the United States. By the age of 10, he had taught himself 8 languages, and at the age of 11, he was the youngest person ever to attend Harvard. It was believed that he had somewhere around a 300 IQ. Because of this, many people had high hopes for Sidis. But after college, he went to work menial labor jobs to make ends meet, and that's what he spent doing for the rest of his life. By the time of his death, Sidis had not contributed meaningfully to any intellectual, creative, or competitive field. Now, one important thing to mention was that his parents, particularly his father, exposed Sidis to an intensive education plan from the time he was in the crib, which probably contributed to his intellectual abilities. As he got older, people obviously noticed these abilities. It's possible that because Sidis had such high intelligence, the people around him continually expected him to do amazing things, and that pressure may have simply been too much for an immature mind to deal with. Maybe he silently rebelled against these expectations by committing to a meager life. If the pressure had never existed, if the high expectations had never come into play, maybe he would have been naturally drawn to the maths or sciences or arts. But this is pure speculation. Either way, this tells us that not all highly intelligent people are considered geniuses. But it does seem to be the case that high intelligence is usually associated with genius. But what is high intelligence? What is intelligence to begin with? I used to believe that intelligence depended on the subject you're looking at. A person can be highly skilled in one area or subject, but can be completely unskilled in other areas. For example, Christopher Walken might be extremely charismatic and good with people, but terrible at math. Because of this, I used to view intelligence as relative. In fact, one of the first notes I wrote on my list when I was 22 was titled, "Why Intelligence is Relative." But after researching it, I realized that the people who administer IQ tests are not trying to measure your knowledge of a specific subject. What they're trying to measure is your general underlying ability to excel at intellectual activities. People with higher IQs aren't just good at certain skills, they're able to get good faster than other people. And because of this, they have a higher ceiling they can hypothetically reach in terms of their peak level of skill, at least when it comes to intellectual tasks. This underlying ability is referred to as the G factor. It's important to note that G factor does seem to play a significant role in life outcomes. It's not always popular to discuss, but many studies have shown that people with higher IQs tend to have more success on average across a wide range of fields. On average, people with higher IQs also tend to make more money, but that has a limit. The people who make the most money in the world don't necessarily have the highest IQs. There are people like William James Sidis who have extremely high IQs but aren't rich or traditionally successful because unfortunately, environment also plays a role in IQ as well as overall success. What you're taught and the way you're taught will affect your approach to solving problems, which will influence your IQ score. Some IQ tests try to compensate for this by developing testing methods which are more universal, and in some cases these probably work. But there will always be areas of intelligence which are affected by learning. A person exposed to spatial reasoning problems when young, such as the ones IQ tests involve, will most likely have an advantage over others when solving those problems. Also, a person born into a highly tumultuous environment or under a totalitarian regime will have a harder time succeeding in a wide variety of areas than someone who isn't. It's just a fact. Intelligence might improve your chances of overcoming these conditions, but it's not a guarantee. Even sleep might affect your IQ scores. At the very least, we know lack of sleep can significantly impact performance on cognitive tasks. Furthermore, genetics most likely do play some role in IQ. But like we've seen with William James Sidis, this may not be the whole story. The early education his parents exposed him to may have contributed to his IQ as well. But even if IQ was a purely genetic thing, intelligence still does not equate to success, and a high IQ does not automatically make you a genius. One extremely important thing that IQ tests cannot account for is a person's level of interest in a subject or field, and your level of interest will always influence how good you can get at something. If you pay no attention to math, you're never going to get good at math, no matter how high your underlying IQ is. At the end of the day, intelligence means very little if you do very little with it. Genius, it seems, requires intelligence and interest to meet. The problem is, interest cannot be manufactured. If a person doesn't care about something, no amount of pressure or berating or training or education will make them care. You can force someone to do a task, but you can't force them to like it. Genuine interest either occurs naturally or it doesn't occur at all. No matter what field you look at, the geniuses of that field are always extremely interested in and dedicated to their craft, regardless of their IQ. This is true in every single case. And since we're on the subject, I might as well give my own hypothesis about intelligence. Intelligence tests attempt to measure what they call G-factor, but I don't think there's just one G-factor. I believe there are actually two separate types of intelligence that influence your mental capabilities, and I think IQ tests only measure one. Believe it or not, I wrote about them in my book. So, what are they? Creative intelligence and process intelligence. Let's start with process intelligence. Say I'm fighting with someone over resources. If I can think several steps ahead of my opponent and then take some kind of action to preempt their moves, not only will that give me an advantage in the fight, but it will require me to do something which is indirect and abstract. Instead of attacking my opponent straight on, I must imagine what my opponent might do and then come up with a plan to counteract the thing I've imagined them doing. Each step ahead that I plan is another step away from my starting position. This type of abstraction is what I call process intelligence. Basically, process intelligence uses imagination to come to logical conclusions. It allows you to mentally envision scenarios, environments, and information, and then arrange that information in a logical way so that you can predict some kind of outcome or generate some kind of solution to a problem. What about creative intelligence? How does that work? Well, let's say I'm trying to figure out a better way to hunt for food, instead of just using my bare hands. If I can think of a creative way around that problem, for instance, if I can craft some kind of never-before-seen weapon, not only could that give me a survival advantage, but it will require me to do things which are indirect and abstract from the main goal I'm trying to accomplish. Instead of going straight for my food, I have to think of a potential weapon, then spend energy trying to build that weapon. And then I have to use that weapon to get my food. The more steps I have to take to think of, build, and use my weapon, the more abstract my ideas and actions will be. This type of abstraction is what I call creative intelligence. Basically, it's your ability to think outside the box, or think of the uncommon. You can probably see where I'm going with this. I personally believe that IQ tests generally only measure process intelligence, and only weakly account for creative intelligence. If you actually pay attention to what's involved in IQ tests, they tend to emphasize your ability to come to logical conclusions, whether that's through spatial reasoning, or memorization, or picture completion. To me, this sounds very much like process intelligence. Some amount of creativity might be necessary to imagine a three-dimensional space, but when you have to arrange that space in a very specific way to get a correct answer, the creativity is a bit restricted, wouldn't you say? I think genius requires much more creative intelligence than an IQ test can ascertain at the moment. Now, you could argue that creative intelligence and process intelligence are actually related. For example, process intelligence is often necessary in creative exercises. Even if you can think of a new weapon that no one's ever invented, you're still going to have to take some logical steps to actually build that weapon. In other words, some amount of process will be necessary to carry out your goal. However, I would argue that the simple act of imagining something unusual, uncommon, or out of the box is in itself a purely creative activity. Also, there can be some amount of creativity involved in thinking several steps ahead. However, doing that in a way that's logical, where one step necessarily leads to the next, is, I would argue, more of a procedural activity rather than a creative activity. This is why I believe creative intelligence and process intelligence are in fact different from each other. They might both be necessary depending on what you're trying to accomplish, but at some level I do think they're separate things. Maybe genius requires both. Maybe a high creative intelligence is what allows you to find uncommon potential, and a high process intelligence allows you to implement that creativity in a way that's useful or valuable to others. But that's just my hypothesis. Now, you remember all those questions I asked in the beginning. Let's go over each of them and see if there aren't some answers we've gathered. First of all, what is genius? In this episode, I define it as a person who is especially talented at perceiving uncommon potential within some intellectual, artistic, or competitive boundary, and who has the requisite ability to realize such potential. What differentiates genius from simple intelligence? Well, if I'm right, IQ tests typically only measure process intelligence, whereas genius may require high creative intelligence to go along with it. Genius also requires high amounts of interest in something. Is genius a trait? Well, if a person or thing can be genius, then genius is a trait. Can a single thought be genius? Most likely, yes. What kinds of thoughts could be considered genius? Thoughts which make use of uncommon potential to successfully achieve an extremely difficult goal, create an extraordinary art piece, or accomplish some highly competitive task. Can a whole person be genius, or is it their creations which are actually genius? Well, based on my definitions, both are possible. In some cases, it may even be possible for a person who is not a genius to create a single genius thing. This could explain the phenomenon of one-hit wonders. Are there different types of genius? Yes, there are musical geniuses, intellectual geniuses, and I also personally believe that there are geniuses within the world of sports and competition. There may even be other kinds of geniuses I haven't covered. Do your ideas need to be right to be genius? Most likely they do need to be right, at least in the intellectual world. People who get everything wrong are never considered geniuses. Is genius more like the process of having a good idea? As I explained, genius can't just be a process, because creative processes as well as trial and error processes don't always lead to genius ideas or inventions. What others think about your ideas does matter to some extent. Does something need broad appeal or broad recognition to be genius? Not necessarily. Popularity does often follow genius, but extreme popularity is not necessary for genius. However, your work still has to have some kind of valuability or appeal to others to be considered genius in most cases. Does genius even exist? I'd say it absolutely does. And here's one last question just for the kicks. Is it possible for someone to lose their genius? I think the answer is yes. If a genius is someone who's especially talented at perceiving uncommon potential, well, the thing about talent is that talents can go away with age or injury. It's a tragic part of human life, but it's true. There's a reason why so many musicians we love fall off and make music with less intensity and less frequency as the years go on. It seems like a pretty common theme that many great geniuses make their most impactful art, or have their best ideas, or accomplish their greatest competitive feats during their youth. This may be connected to the fact that young minds are more malleable, and with creative intelligence especially, malleability may be selected for. But this is a double-edged sword, because as you age, your brain's malleability typically diminishes. I do believe it's possible to sort of extend your talents with lots of discipline and some luck. And by discipline, I mean spending lots of time every day practicing your craft. But even then, no amount of discipline can defeat the aging process. Time has a perfect track record of destroying all living things. This is why I believe anyone with any kind of talent must use what youth they have to accomplish as much as possible. Because make no mistake, your talents will eventually disappear, and the less you use them, the faster they'll disappear. On top of that, you have no idea how circumstances around you will change. You should never assume that your talents and abilities, even intellectual abilities, will just be there for you to fall back on forever. In my opinion, you should achieve what you can while you can. However, I will say this. Even if you are past your so-called prime, I believe making art and engaging in creative activities can still be a fulfilling thing for many individuals, regardless of how popular that art becomes. Some people are simply born to create, and that's all there is to it. Just my 2 cents. So that's what I think about genius. For all 2 listeners of this podcast, it's probably going to take me a minute to get another episode out. What I'm starting to realize is that with each passing episode, I'm putting in more and more effort, which is causing the release times to be longer. And I don't see this trend slowing down. Plus, I still have a day job. Just know that if you're not hearing anything from me, I am still working on this podcast in some manner. Either that or I died. Anyway, that's it. If you liked this episode, feel free to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. And if you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And again, go read my book if you're interested. You can even get a paperback copy of the book from Amazon if you're a collector or if you're just one of those people who likes being able to hold a book in your hands when you read. Links down below. Till next time.